Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti al webinar Enterprise Risk Management in Europe, a comparative analysis of the impact of ERM on company performance and the shareholder value. Oggi avremo l'onore di approfondire la visione di Enterprise Risk Management a livello europeo con un panel di relatori che dall'Italia raggiunge persino la Svezia. Ricordo però che il webinar sarà tenuto in lingua inglese, per qualsiasi dubbio c'è la chat e noi siamo come sempre a vostra disposizione. Alla fine del webinar, per coloro che l'hanno richiesto, ci sarà il test RUIVAS, proietteremo come al solito la slide. Non mi resta che augurare a voi tutti un buon webinar e lasciare la parola a Paola Radaelli, vicepresidente di ANRA. A presto.
Thank you, Angelica. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's conference. ANRA's president and I thank all attendees for the time dedicated to this meeting and all researchers and professors who dedicated their time to this research and for sharing their knowledge with us. In particular, we thank Professor Maffei for his leadership and design of this project and for moderating today's conference. ANRA is endeavoring to support risk management and risk managers in being more and more successful and effective. So, Professor Maffei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paola. I'm really pleased to moderate this webinar. But first of all, I'm particularly grateful for this association for organizing the event and giving the opportunity to present the volume enterprise risk management in Europe. But a special thanks goes to you because you accepted with enthusiasm the participation in this project and you promoted the organization of this webinar. So really, really thanks. I'm also grateful to the speakers who have contributed the creation of this volume. We were not able to invite all the contributors, of course, so we made a sort of a selection, giving a picture of what is the situation of enterprise risk management in Europe. The speakers will bring their experience from many countries, so of course from Italy, where there are Rosanna Spanò from University of Naples, Federici II, from Paola that you already know, from the Netherlands, who there is the speaker Nicola Dalla Via that now works for the Boson University. Then it will be the colleagues from Portugal. Now she's not connected, Claudia Pinto. We hope we will solve soon the technical issues. Then we have Jason Crawford from Sweden and Irma Malafronte from United Kingdom. As moderator, my aim is to respect the schedule and address some file questions to the speakers. How we are going to organize this meeting? We are going to address two main themes, which will be discussed in two different rounds. The two themes are, the first one, point of connection between risk management and control, more focused on management or on control. Second theme, change in external conditions, how do they impact the risk management role? I do not want to take time away from the speakers who have just 5-6 minutes each to discuss the topics in these two different rounds. Therefore, I invite immediately Jason to start with this discussion on the first theme, point of connection between risk management and control. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Paola, and thank you, Marco, for this opportunity, and a big welcome to all the attendees this morning at this webinar. I think the first theme is very important. It's a good starting point because we have to contextualize what we mean by control and what we mean by management, first of all. And I speak foremost as a researcher that talks extensively to practitioners and also from the Swedish context. And I think that whenever we talk about control, we understand it more as compliance, a policing type function, more orientated towards risk quantification and silo type risk management. Whenever we talk about management, we see it that moving more into the business, that the lines of demarcation between the three lines of defense are softer than they are in control. And we see that managers start to begin to operate as business partners to the business. So it's not alone about satisfying external requirements, but also about helping business managers deal with uncertainty that comes up both in daily operations, but also related to the strategy. The second point I would like to make about it in the Swedish context is that ERM in Sweden, at least, has been strongly connected to internal control, and that is based in two things really. First of all, its foundations in the internal control framework from COSO that also was the nucleus for enterprise risk management, and also from the Code of Corporate Governance. But however, Sweden has another orientation in that a lot of organizations have decentralized decision making. So while we have this emphasis on control, we also see that risk managers are pragmatic. They're getting out there into the business. They're helping in different areas, helping the division and business unit managers get involved there and solve the actual problems that they have on the ground. I think we also need to make a distinction here whenever we talk about control and management between financial and non-financial firms, and this is an important part, and especially what we see in NGOs and SMEs, for example. We see that in financial firms in Sweden, perhaps elsewhere, there has been a strong orientation towards control, but that is shifting increasingly towards management. In Sweden, many organizations see that while control is necessary and an important part of governance, it also has its limitations in terms of raising risk awareness, and we talk about risk awareness continually, and how to make people cognizant of risks and how to change mindsets in the organization. So in Sweden, control takes a different connotation or a slightly different understanding compared to other European countries, perhaps. And finally, I think that very often whenever we talk to Swedish companies, they're very much focused on the engage with risk management, enterprise risk management. Yes, it's important to comply with the codes, but also looking at the benefits for the organization. Will it lead to competitive advantage? So those are the points on the first theme from me. Thank you.
Marco? Please open, turn on your microphone.
Right, it was turned off. Thank you, Jason. I would like to introduce Nicola, who can bring his view.
Yes, thank you, Marco, and thank you also, Paula, for the invitation. In my speech, I will focus on the Netherlands, as Marco mentioned before. So just to give you just two lines of context, the Netherlands is a country with a population of about 17 million people, and it's the 6th largest economy in the European Union, with a gross domestic product of about 700-800 billion euro, and 81% of the GDP is driven by Dutch exports. So domestic international demand are favored by fiscal health, so we can find the headquarters of several multinational companies, and public debt is continuously declining. Finance is quietly concentrated. There are only 4 commercial banks owning over 80% of banking assets, and are mainly oriented towards international business. So concerning the regulation, the most recent update to the corporate governance legislation took place in 2016, when important changes to the code were implemented. Basically 2: the focus on long-term value creation and the introduction of culture as an element of good corporate governance. So these are the 2 pillars of the new legislations. The core of the regulation is represented by the chapter on long-term value creation, risk management, and the related accountability. So the regulation is principle-based. According to the main principle, the company should have adequate risk management control systems in place. In addition, the management board is responsible for identifying and managing the risk associated with the company's strategy and activities. So different than the previous version of the code, which broadly described how a company should implement this risk management control system, the 2016 code, so the new one, emphasizing more these topics and distinguishes between explicitly between the phases of risk assessment, implementation, and monitoring. So it's a quite recent introduction. First, we have a management board that should identify and analyze the risk associated with the strategy and activities of the company. As part of the assessment, risks are commonly categorized in strategic risk, operational risk, reporting risk, and compliance risks. Risks include both internal and external risks and are identified using bottom-down or top-down, or bottom-up or top-down approach. Right. Risks include risk appetite is also important, so it's identified by the company, and basically the company needs to estimate the risk importance, the potential impact, and the likelihood and appropriate measure also to avoid or mitigate the described risks. In the second phase, so risk implementation, based on the risk assessment, the management board should design, implement, and maintain adequate internal risk management control system, and the regulation emphasizes the dynamic nature of such systems. Okay, not so the previous code was more on with a static vision. Thus, it is crucial to constantly modify and adapt the systems in response to changes in strategy or business processes and to integrate them in the business processes itself. The last phase is monitoring and effectiveness. As in the previous phase, the regulation highlights again the risk management and control system are not static. The management should monitor the operation of the internal risk management and should carry out a systematic assessment of the design and effectiveness at least once a year. Okay, that's also something that has been introduced recently. In practice, monitoring is accomplished through ongoing management activities, separate evaluations, or both. The 2016 code explicitly clarified that such monitoring extends to financial and non-financial aspects, as also mentioned by Jason, and covers all material control measures related to strategic, operation, compliance, and reporting risks. So in the latest version of the regulation, the internal audit function, and I want to stress this point, is also important in assessing the design and operation of the control system. So to strengthen its function, the corporate governance code involves more the supervisory board in the appointment, evaluation, dismissal of the senior internal auditor. Okay, and different than the past, the supervisory board also directly oversees the function and maintains regular contact with the internal auditor. The internal audit function should draw up an audit plan and involve in the process the management board, the audit committee, and the external auditor. So it's a more comprehensive process. And the work carried out based on the plan and the associated outcomes are relevant for risk management, especially for the risk section of the management report and for the statements to be given by the management board. Just two numbers to conclude. So based on a recent survey, I can mention that 35% of the respondents to this national survey appointed a chief risk officer explicitly, so that's I would say an interesting figure to monitor the status of risk management in the Netherlands, and the percentage increases to 58% when we look at the listed companies. So companies are increasingly more confident about the risk management systems, but the maturity is still quite dispersed because only 50% of the companies present them with a partially or fully implemented risk management system. So there is still quite a bit of work to do. Thanks.
The microphone, please.
Again.
Sorry, I forget to turn on. I said we have already two different perspectives from Sweden and the Netherlands. So I'm sure that now Irma can provide even a different picture for United Kingdom. Thank you, Irma.
Okay, sure. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Paola and Marco, for your kind introduction and for inviting me for this interesting webinar today. And of course, a warm welcome to all the attendees. Just very, very briefly, for those of you who have not met me before, my name is Irma Malafronte. As Marco anticipated, I work as a senior lecturer in accounting and finance at Renton University in London. And so apart from lecturing on these topics, I'm also a researcher in the area of corporate reporting, risk disclosure, market discipline, and more recently, I'm interested in the areas in the emerging topics of sustainability and integrated reporting. But going straight to your question, Marco, your first question is about the relationship between and the point of connection between risk management and internal control. Yeah, from my perspective, it is without doubt that these two topics are strictly related. If we want to manage risks, we need to put in place an adequate and an appropriate internal control system. So the connection is clear and it is obvious. And I will try to give an overview of what emerged from the UK regulation and the UK Corporate Governance Code regarding these two aspects. The purpose of every risk management and internal control system is always to identify risks, first of all, but it goes beyond that. So it is also about managing risks and controlling risks. So management and control are always two crucial pillars of any risk management and control system. And of course, this is not a standalone exercise. This has to be put in place with respect to the needs of an organization. So what are the company activities? What are the management policies, the objectives, the purpose, who are the internal and the external stakeholders? And in doing so, the internal control system is so important because it allows an organization to achieve its objectives. And internal control is so related to risk management that it can be considered as a risk reduction method of responding to risk. So when we think about how to address risks, the internal control system helps with reducing the exposure to risk. More specifically about the UK context, risk management is certainly a responsibility of the corporate governance structure of an organization. A good risk management, a good internal control is an example of good corporate governance for an organization. And this is one of the key topics that emerge in the UK Corporate Governance Code. In the UK, the Corporate Governance Code is a very important document that has been refined over time. The most recent published version is dated 2018. And it requires companies to maintain a sound risk management and internal control system, and explicitly mentions that the board of directors is responsible for managing a company's exposure to risk. So clearly the management side emerges very clearly. So it is the board that needs to ensure that the necessary resources are in place for a company to meet its objectives, and it is the board that needs to put in place a framework of prudent and effective control. But I would like to stress a couple of more points. So management, first of all, but there are some interesting further points that emerge in the UK Corporate Governance Code. It also clearly states that the board should monitor a company's risk management and internal control system and put in place an ongoing review, ideally annually, of its effectiveness, and talk about it in the regular communication that every organization produces towards a stakeholder. So again, management and monitoring and control, the two key pillars you asked us to reflect on in the first question, Marco. I would say they both emerge very clearly in the UK regulation on the UK Corporate Governance Code. And yeah, for any of you who would be interested to read more, the Financial Reporting Council website is the place where you can read more about the code and in general the UK regulation on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Irma, very much for your first discussion. And now it's up to Rosanna, who will bring the perspective from Italy.
So thank you, Marco, and thank you, Paola, for the invitation. Good morning to everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Just to contextualize, I am Rosanna Spanò. I'm an assistant professor of accounting at the University of Naples, Federico II. And well, the main idea of my intervention today is to be a bit provoking and to try to provoke a debate on this question. I will probably offer more of a reflection than an answer to our question, because I think that this is a question which comes along with other additional questions, and is a question which opens doubts and debates instead of offering absolute responses. And so just to start, I am very critical on regard the point of connection between management and control within the domain of risk management, because I probably would guess that if we are still talking about separating the management and the control souls in risk-related domains, we are probably still too detached from the future reality, not only of our business, but of our daily lives in a future which is actually foreseeable. So my thinking here is quite extreme, and I already apologize for that, but this is to just foster thinking on it. Because my thesis is basically that we should try to draw down enclosure walls, overcoming enclosure walls, to try to stick more on connections and linkages which are based on a shared common culture and common language within organizations. And to support my thesis, a premise is necessary. I'm not talking about fulfilling a fuzzy architecture of controls. So from an organizational point of view, I clearly long and go for a really clear architecture of controls and really clear approach to management. What I'm saying is something that is quite behind the issues of the organizational structure, and which focuses with the value and valorization of a risk-based culture throughout our organizational models. And I guess that this would be highly beneficial for all those companies that does not respond to the classical model of for-profit large organizations. My view, in fact, comes from a research journey which is quite unusual for risk management researchers, because it comes from highly professionalized and complex organizations such as healthcare, universities, non-profit ones, and also several experience in SMEs. And in all these kind of organizations, we do not really have shared models of corporate governance, shared models of risk management. Instead, we have several heterogeneous professional souls that have to interact and then to find common ways to deal with risks that exceeds the common knowledge and the common awareness of risks within the business settings. So to support my thesis of a shared common language and culture within organization as the answer to the call for understanding more of the separation between management and control, I guess that there are two main points to focus on. First point is that the debate on separation versus integration within organization is no longer up to date. And we should create a community of ideas and practice, merging together academics, policymakers, and practitioners to better understand these issues, also sticking on something that we probably left aside sometimes, that is the constitutive role that accounting and accountability, broadly intended, could play within organizations. And this leads us to the second theme. We are used to intend accounting and accountability often in their nature of technical tools, forgetting that these represent fundamental and crucial social practices within organizations. And if we embrace this broader perspective, we can intend accounting and accountability within organizations as languages, as common languages that can drive negotiation between the various business partners participating at various titles and at various stages in the management and control of risks towards a business culture. And finally, I would suggest an how-to strategy. And this how-to strategy mainly deals with two issues. First, the need to push more collaboration and more extension in the research areas regarding risk management and risk control. And this is important in settings such as Italy, where usually the academic community has mainly focused on internal control, internal audit issues, financial issues relating to risks. And there are still, there are actually several networking activities, but these are still fragmented while we need more. And second, I think that this perspective is extremely relevant from the perspective of the practice, because still in countries such as Italy, we can interpret the ERM under the umbrella of internal control and internal audit, while also in the other intervention of our colleagues, it is evident that this happens due to contextual factors that in the case of Italy are related to a structured regulation.
Anna, excuse me, you have just 20 seconds to finish your first.
Okay, I'm concluding. But I would suggest that more networking between academics, practitioners, and policymakers will mark the difference on this regard towards a truly shared risk culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosanna, and I apologize for stopping you. And Jason, Nicola, Irma, and Rosanna are academicians, some researchers. So now it's time that Paola, who is a practitioner, can bring her view on this topic.
Okay, thank you, Marco, and thank you to all researchers. Well, as Marco said, I'm taking the practitioner point of view, and my point of view is that risk management is much more than control. But we have to differentiate between risk management and risk managers, just to understand better this point. Starting from risk management, ISO 31000 says the purpose of risk management is the creation and protection of value. It improves performance, encourages innovation, and supports the achievement of objectives. So let's go a little bit in detail on the maturity path of risk management. And I pick James Lamb maturity model as a model. So at the beginning, risk management's purpose is to protect enterprises from crisis. Later on, when it is a little bit more mature, risk management does not only protect from crisis, but even from the compliance, the miscompliance with regulation. The third is controls, making all controls strong and present in the company, the third path. The fourth path is to introduce the acceptance framework, so limits and measurement within the company. The fifth, the last path, is to introduce risk-based performance measures. And so we can see that controls are always present in all these maturity paths. But risk management is doing much more than only controls, which seem to be a little bit passive. So let's go to the risk managers now. We know that risk managers have a second level control function. And so we say we do controls. But as I said before, we do a little bit more than controls. Well, I just remember the other roles. Risk owners are the persons who have responsibility and accountability on the management of risks. The internal auditor at the third level, and the top management is the leader and has the commitment on this manager. So we have several roles supporting risk management. But what about risk managers? We do not have only a contingent role which defines policies, helps defining policies, procedures, and controls. We have other two important roles. We have an umbrella function, like Rosanna said before. The umbrella function is to give all the other roles equal tools and techniques. It is one function. Then we have another function, and it is to analyze the interconnections of risks, interconnection between different risks, interconnection between different functions and different processes. Why? Because the third level control model has a limit in these interconnections. And then the umbrella function covers even the risks which are out of the sight of risk owners, like creeping risks and emerging risks. But we have another function, and which is the strategic function, just like Jason previously mentioned. And the strategic function is to support the enterprise to fulfill objectives and reach decided strategies. And so I'm convinced that risk management and risk managers do make controls, but do even something more to control. They contribute to the management of the company. It's all, Marco.
Thank you very much. And I'm already so, I already appreciated your contributions, because we have really, in a European perspective, there are many differences among countries. And I suppose that now that I'm going to introduce the second theme, this evidence will be even stronger. First of all, I know that one attendee has raised a question. All the questions will be proposed to the speakers at the end of this webinar. So let's introduce the second theme, which is changes in external conditions. How do they impact the risk management role? At this point, I believe is the most important one in my point of view, because a cultural perspective that will in some way impact this function. So again, I will start with Jason. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. And I think that we, in answering this, I think that I cannot help but connect back to some of the very important things said by the other panelists in regards to the first theme. But taking again, starting off with the Swedish context here, all external conditions are contextual, and I think that we have to look at whenever we talk about what kind of industries it is, what type of companies. And I think that we've talked about, I think it was Rosanna that talked about, there isn't exactly a universal approach here. We see a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what organizations are actually exposed to in the external environment, and that reflects in how they manage risks in the internal environment. But from Sweden's context, it's a small open economy. It is a high dependence on trade, a lot of exports and so on, and industrial machinery, electronics and communications. few large owners, which also affects how it impacts the risk management role. And there's many Swedish companies that have a global reach as well. So if I connect back that to what has been said earlier in the bigger picture, a few weeks ago, risk resilience was talked about at FIRMA at the European level, and we see that there's a lot of things going on right now that is shaping the role of risk management and risk managers. We have increasing concerns around ESG risks, about sustainability, about cybersecurity. We have issues in the South China Sea, for example, that is affecting supply chains and so on. So while we have contextual issues, the exposure to international markets places new demands on, not just in terms of the control of risks, but also the management of risks that Paula talked about earlier, about decision making and about the uncertainty around these things. So that's incredibly important. We see also now that there's new demands in terms of, we've had the COP26, which is still ongoing at the moment. We see that there's new changes in accounting regulation. We also see that we're moving towards the electrification of everything, and what are the implications of this. So I think that from a purely control perspective, risk managers are now being invited into a space where perhaps not the role is being revolutionized, but certainly it is evolving into something quite new. They have an incredibly important role in helping organizations deal with those types of uncertainty. I think that Rosanna also talked about, I think, integration was an important aspect there. And I think that we will see that there is an important role there for risk managers to be increasingly involved in how they integrate risk management into different processes, into different activities and so on. So it'll be interesting to discuss about the relationship between enterprise risk management and this integration into management control systems. In a Swedish context, we can see that the role is certainly changing because of that pragmatic approach. Swedish risk managers, despite the limited resources, which often eat up time in terms of fulfilling these control requirements or control obligations that Paolo talked about earlier, they also need to get into the strategic space to be able to get the ear of senior management and become involved in strategic discussion. So I think that they are particularly successful in doing that, but there's a lot of work to be done in that space yet. So I'll leave it at that, Marco. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just take less than 1 minute to introduce Claudia Pinto, who probably solved her technical issues. And Claudia, we are now discussing the second SEM, and differently from our first schedule, I will introduce you again after Rosanna, so you have time to listen to our colleagues now. So I will give you, I ask to Nicola to discuss the second SEM.
Yes, thank you, Marco. So again, I will talk about the Netherlands. So a major event that triggered several corporate governance and accounting reforms in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, was the Royal Hold financial scandal, so an accounting fraud that happened in the Netherlands in 2003. So only a couple of years after the Enron scandal. So the same year, the Dutch Corporate Governance Code was published, so as a reaction to this scandal. So as a consequence, starting from 2004, listed companies are expected to devote a chapter of the annual report to outline the corporate governance system of the company and its compliance to the code. So the new regulation significantly changed the approach towards risk management, introducing new duties and defining levels of accountability. So the Dutch legislation, on the one hand, is more relaxed than the US SOX regulation, because a company with a governance structure not fully compliant with the recommended ERM principle and practices must provide an appropriate justification. So it's allowed to deviate from the application of the best practices, but this deviation must be explained in the annual report, and a specific reason must be provided. This is the so-called comply or explain approach. In contrast, SOX is based on the Anglo-Saxon model of corporate governance, which is strongly rule-based, and if deviate from a rule, then it's considered a violation. So under such model, the adoption of governance rules not compliant with ERM principles and practice leads to penalties. So we have this contrast between the two. So in the Anglo-Saxon model also consists of one-tier board structure with only executive directors or both executive and non-executive directors in a single corporate body. The board of directors is elected by the shareholders, to whom the board is also accountable, and integrates the decision-making and decision control. Whereas the Rhineland model, which is the model, the classical Dutch model of governance, consists of a two-tier board structure with two separate corporate bodies for decision-making and decision control. So a management board composed by executive directors and a supervisory board composed by non-executive directors. In this context, the shareholders are seen more as stakeholders alongside customers, suppliers, and employees. So that's also an important difference. The composition of the board of directors represents various stakeholders and operates under the control of a supervisory board. So both the board of directors and the supervisory board have specific responsibility in terms of risk management, policies, and practices. They are involved in assessing the effectiveness of the design and operation of the internal risk management control system. Until recently, it was not possible to adopt a one-tier governance system in the Netherlands, but to attract international investments and to support domestic companies operating worldwide, in 2013, the legislator enacted the one-tier governance system in addition to the customary two-tier system. And some Dutch list companies switched to the one-tier system. But then again, after recent legislative interventions, the differences between the two systems are becoming minimal, and risk management best practices have been adapted to reflect both the one-tier and the two-tier governance systems. On the other hand, the Dutch legislation is more comprehensive than SOX. Okay, so compared to SOX, the Dutch principle urged the management board to broaden the scope of the statements about the effectiveness of risk management and control system that have to be included in the management report. In particular, accountability is not limited to financial reporting risks and applies to all material risks. These risks may include strategic, operation, compliance, and reporting risks. These extensions of the principle to other material risks associated with the company's strategy and activity, as well as to design and operation of risk management and control system, are amendments that is worth to highlight, given the restrictive provisions deliberately included in the previous version of the code. And the extensive provisions, to conclude, fits well with the risk priorities identified by the recent report, Risk in Focus 2022, published by the Confederation of the Institutes of Internal Auditing, because the top three risk areas are cybersecurity and data privacy, changes in law and regulations, digital disruption, new technology, and artificial intelligence. Notably, climate change and environmental sustainability is constantly climbing the ranking and is now considered a principal risk. So, given that we need to cover all material risks, that's something that fits well with the new trends and the risks that should be taken into account in the future. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Now, Irma, it's up to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Marco, again. And yes, personally, I think it's a very interesting and especially timely question, thinking about external conditions and how they impact risk management. In our previous roundtable, we already touched on some of these points. So it is clear that a sound risk management system needs to be in line with the company's activities, the objectives, the company's purpose, and any kind of input coming from internal and external stakeholders. So the first word, the first adjective that comes into my mind is dynamic. So a risk management system needs to be dynamic and needs to be able to reflect and to react to external conditions. And we can think about so many examples, even very recent or current, about the need for risk management to adapt to external circumstances. I'm sure the first that comes into our mind is the current pandemic that has stressed the importance of companies to adapt to external conditions, and the same applies to a risk management system. But of course, it's much more beyond that. The dynamic aspect of risk management has always been there. There is uncertainty. The world is changing very fast. And there are a lot of emerging risks that organizations need to face that on one side represent an opportunity, on the other represents an increased exposure to risk. One that comes into my mind, for example, is the technology, the digital revolution, the artificial intelligence. It is certainly a great opportunity. It means having a high availability of data, connectivity, the possibility to take a decision faster. Thanks to technology, we are here today, and we are able to talk and discuss, each of us sitting in different areas in Europe. So it is certainly a great opportunity also for the development of our companies. But at the same time, it may be a threat. So it may be a security issue. And one of the most recent topic in terms of external conditions for organization is certainly the climate change and all the pressure that directly and indirectly this is putting on companies, coming from investors, coming from government. So so I think the first point I would like to stress on the content of external conditions is the need for any internal control system to be dynamic, very dynamic and flexible, and able to navigate through a future that is more and more unpredictable for companies. From a practical point of view, how to do that? Is there a recipe? Because some concepts are easy to mention from a theoretical point of view, but maybe much more complicated to put in place. When we do research in this area, I like using the expression "one size does not fit all." There is no unique recipe. One size does not fit all. A one-size-fits-all approach certainly doesn't work. There are differences across companies, across industries, and I think one of the panelists before also mentioned about the difference, I think, Jason, between a variety of sectors that have a variety of needs. But the key message is that I believe needs to be part of the organizational culture is this proactive approach and this ability to respond to external conditions and adapt the risk management process accordingly. Just to conclude about my insight, my perspective from UK. In the UK, apart from the corporate governance code that I mentioned before, there is also another interesting document that is a guidance on risk management, internal control, and also financial reporting. And among its pillars, it explicitly mentions the importance of monitoring and reviewing the risk management and internal control system. is a bit like the duality we were discussing before. So managing risks, controlling risks on one side, but that is not enough. So monitoring and reviewing the risk management system. And again, this is a crucial responsibility of the board of directors. Apart from making sure that there is an adequate internal control system, that risks are identified, the risk management process needs to be monitored, reviewed, and personally, I believe even more important, everything needs to be communicated, disclosed to internal and external stakeholders. So, in a nutshell, the risk management internal control system.
Sorry,
yeah.
just 20 seconds to finish your speech.
Okay, perfect. So just to summarize, the key message I wanted to give on the topic of external conditions is that there is no unique recipe, there is a need for flexibility, but very important, this has to be part of the organizational culture. So any initiative put in place in an organization that help integration and respond to external conditions are very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for stopping you. And now, Rosanna, please.
So thank you, Marco. Well, in terms of focusing on external conditions, I would like to start with a brief reference to the Italian context, which I guess it's very well known to the majority of our attendees today. So we are talking about the effect on external conditions on ERM in a country which has long dealt with crises and drops in investments and only recent effort in a national strategy and national incentives for the common issues that we have already mentioned for other countries: innovation, digitalization, social services, sustainability, climate change, and so on and so forth. Coupled with these economic landscapes, ERM acts within a context which is under what I used to call a regulatory entropia. There is in Italy a really unsystematic regulatory environment, especially concerning risks, where we assist to a really prolific of the legislature, who is really prolific in many domains. But this does not contribute to have a systematic approach to risk regulation, instead creating areas of complexity, areas of overlaps and gaps, areas in which there is an excess in positive written law, and areas in which more soft requirements could be and should be helpful. And this, in a way, creates a culture of based on compliance logics and the search for external legitimacy, and at the cost clearly of a substantive approach to risk control and risk management in the daily business practices of our organizations. And again, these contribute to a detachment from the classic large size organizations and the rest of the business world. And these conditions are coupled with the research that is really far from reaching a satisfactory level of analysis and investigation of ERM operationalization processes, thus creating a detachment with daily business practice and policy making, and above all, which left all of us wondering who is the risk manager of tomorrow and how academia is contributing to shape the figure of the risk manager of tomorrow. We have, for example, a number of very valuable training initiatives by association. This is an example of one of these training initiatives. But we as academicians within a community of ideas and practices, as I mentioned before, need to ask what we can do also at the university level. So in a very, very anticipated and proactive manner to answer to the market call for more risk managers, especially on the issues relating to emerging risks that also the colleagues have cited. And we need to deal in a very proactive and anticipating manner with at least three issues that I try to summarize also on the basis of what the colleagues have mentioned before. First, the COVID pandemic has even pressured more the issues of business continuity, because we assisted to breakdowns that we have never expected over the last 20 years, but now we are aware and we need to do something. We need to deal on the requests for more sustainability, ESG, SDGs, and so on and so forth. We need to deal with issues that also compels strong and complex ethical issues that are related to the pressure for digitalization and technological evolution, bearing in mind that these in a business context can create a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation, and this is not really a panacea. And I do believe that if together as a community we will stick in a proactive manner on these issues, this will probably mark the difference, especially in Italy, in three main ways. First, to contribute to consolidate the risk manager figure and the CRO figures within the architecture of the corporate governance, to establish more risk-based accounting and accountability processes, I mentioned before, which is a translation in practice of a risk-based culture, and finally favoring greater accountability far beyond the external legitimacies that the majority of companies are actually pursuing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosanna. Now we can ask to Claudia to turn on the camera and please give your perspective from both.
Sorry, but I have a family problem and I have to abandon the webinar. Okay, sorry for the delay, and my father called me at this moment and is not well, so I'm sorry, but I have to abandon the webinar.
Okay, Claudia, thank you very much.
Okay, bye. Sorry.
Yes. Paola, so it's up to you to close this for a second round.
Okay, I have 3 points to underline, to comment 3 points. The first point, the higher the complexity, the higher the importance of a risk manager. And complexity, as all other speakers said before, is steadily increasing. Just some examples: technology, regulations, climate change, and unfortunately, pandemia. So all these external conditions made companies understand that protection and reaction is important, and the risk manager give a great contribution in this condition, because when things are changing and changing quickly, a good risk manager is more and more important. The second point, not a little bit connected with what Rosanna said before, is that when companies understand that resilience is value, they praise more and more risk managers and business continuity managers. And increasing disruptions, external disruption, even from climate change, drive more and more the necessity for companies to being able to react and restore quickly. So even when companies understand this, and this is part of the value, because if you think that these managers avoid accidents, obviously it's wrong. It is impossible to avoid everything. But that these managers and business continuity manager help restoring from accidents, And this is the value. And this is what stakeholders and shareholders ask to the company. So the risk management contribution to the company is placed more than before. The last point regards regulations. Regulation that support the effectiveness of risk management help risk managers. On the contrary, regulations which require just compliance and formal adoptions of rules, they divert resources from effective risk management. And so regulation can help if, I said before, effectiveness is the aim, the purpose. So that's all.
Thank you, Paola. And just to give some words before opening to the questions, it seems that we are ready to introduce a 4.0 risk management figure, because there are new challenges in the future, in the near future, that the risk manager can really contribute in some way to the creative value in the company. In my point of view, at least at the European level, it's important to introduce a regulation or to enrich previous regulation with risk management issues, because at the moment, there are, apart from the banking sector or the assurance sector, there are not any special requests for risk manager. It could be really useful that the European Union could design in some way the introduction of these practices. Now it's time for questions. We have received some questions, and especially there are two attendees who asked the role or the difference of the risk manager and the security manager. I can address this question just to Paola, and even asking if you can provide her perspective on these two roles or different roles. I don't know, you can give your perspective, but also I can give my question, which is, but it's acceptable that the risk manager does not control at all?
Oh, no, it's not acceptable. I start for the second question and then I go to the first one, which is easier. So, well, it's not acceptable that these managers don't control at all. But there is a short-term perspective and a long-term one. In a long-term perspective, control is obviously essential, because we can't know if our process is effective, if our framework is effective, if we do not make controls. So controls are necessary for awareness. But in a short-term perspective, it may happen that other issues are more important than control, or better than extensive controls. So it can happen, for example, during the pandemic was an example, when controls could be shortened or simplified for the absence of resources. And in that case, it was exceptionally important that risk managers and risk owners could make the right choices. In those cases, risk management becomes more effective, because there are changes and it is necessary to react and react quickly. So controls are necessary, but there can sometimes, in the short term, there can be some decisions have to be made. So security managers, well, risk management is developing and it is becoming more and more complex. So risk managers have more and more an umbrella function and have to connect with specialties. Business continuity manager is one specialty, security manager is another specialty, and so on. modelists are our specialists. And so there are differences. The security managers are experts of security. And what is important is, as Rosanna said before, a common language, because tools and methodologies should have to be the same for both roles. It's to you, Marco.
The microphone, please.
Sorry. I have not received other questions from the attendees, so I can invite them to write some questions in the chat. But I can address, for example, a question to Jason, and if I can provide a picture about the difference between the risk management and risk control in terms of fostering shared understandings.
Thank you, Marco. I think that again, I really need to take up on a few of the aspects that Paula has taken up in terms of increasing complexity, increasing specialization here, because we talk about shared understandings, we talk about the role of tools and methodologies and so on, but we increasingly see that risk managers have a very important role, an educational role in the organization in terms of how, not alone how they produce knowledge about risk, but also how they share it and they help others in the organization interpret that. So they have a big cognitive burden, I would say, in that role. And that burden increases, of course, whenever you have more concerns around sustainability, ESG risks, cybersecurity, data security, and so on. So there's a lot of work has to be done there. So I think that in creating value, I think that we collectively, individually and collectively, have an important role in terms of how we support risk managers in developing knowledge, developing new skills, developing those different competencies that allow risk management to evolve into a true form of enterprise risk management. Because sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, but in reality, for me at least, it marks the demarcation between risk management in terms of more orientated towards control and risk control, and then risk managers in the sense of business partnering. And we see that from research, for example, that those that are most successful in creating shared understandings, they are involved in terms of inviting the business managers into the co-creation of methodologies, the development of new tools, for example, that they're sharing those tools with the wider organization, educating them in terms of how to use them and so on. So these are incredibly important aspects of creating shared understandings and put huge demands on the role of risk managers, not just now, but definitely into the future as complexity expands. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. We have received another question who asks how many CRO are in the board. I can address this question to Nicola, who can provide the perspective from the Netherlands.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. I saw the question on the chat, so I was thinking if I have some announcement from thinking about the survey that I mentioned during my speech, and I mentioned that about 35% of the companies appointed formally a chief risk officer, and or let's say a similar function, so maybe not explicitly a chief risk officer, but maybe a security manager or a risk manager, without the title of chief. And if we see within these companies, among these companies, let's say that 1/3 have a chief risk officer who is also a member of the board. Okay, then 1/3 is a similar function, not formally a chief risk officer, but a similar function, who is also on the board. And then 1/3 of companies adopted a chief risk officer or similar function, but this person is not a member of the board of directors. So this is a trend that is also changing over time. So more and more companies are adding the seat of the chief risk officer to the board of directors, but I would say we are still lagging quite a bit behind. I don't know whether there are also other point of views from maybe other countries.
Yes, of course, if someone would like to add some perspective on this question, you can answer.
Maybe I can just add a few lines. In a recent paper that we did focusing on these kind of figures, we just reckoned, focusing actually on CFOs and CROs, we actually reckoned that when they are in the board at the European level, so this is quite mixed countries, but when they are in the board, they tend to highly impact on R&D innovation strategies of the companies. And it is, in my view, quite intriguing because it clearly depends also on their background, age, and so on and so forth. But it is quite informative in the perspective of the business partnership of this kind of subjects that we were talking about before. So it could probably be an integrating element to those which already Nicola illustrated. Thanks.
Thank you, Rosanne. I can just ask also to you another perspective, if you agree. How do digital technologies will impinge the risk management domain? Well,
thank you a lot because the theme of digital technologies in the risk domain is a theme that I really cherish and I've focused on over the last couple of years. And I think that this is quite intriguing from both the academic and the practical perspective because it can be observed from different perspectives and it brings together different points of view. So the starting point is that we are living what I tend to call in a way a digitocracy. We all are talking about digitalization, technological revolution. We really long for these kind of changes within organizations, but sometimes these changes end up in a kind of useless way, either because they are not really implemented. So the new changes and the new strategies are played in parallel with previous business practices, or because these changes can potentially create value for the organization, but there's a detachment between those who propose the change and those who are actually called to do and to ensure that the change is effective within organization. So this is a really first line of response because risk management and risk managers can benefit a lot from these changes relating to technology within organizations because clearly these kind of changes open new ways and new opportunities of applicability of the risk management profession within organization. And secondly, because they as professionals can benefit from renewed ways of dealing with their tasks thanks to technologies. And this is a theme which is recalling the attention of many associations, many policymakers, many practical and practitioners subjects. There is a wave in the application of these technologies within organization, but actually one of the points that is under scrutiny and which is still unanswered deals with the behavioral issues relating to these changes. As a behavioral researcher at the beginning of my career, I would say that we should attentively take into account the fact that implementation without embeddedness for these digital technologies it's really dangerous for organizations which are investing incredible amount of resources, not only financial resources, but also in terms of personal, intellectual capital, and so on and so forth. So this is quite an opportunity, but not a panacea, as I was illustrating before. This is something that needs to be handled with particular attention and taking into account that people like risk managers who are called to actually implement and use these technologies needs to attentively evaluate their if the effect of these technologies on their tasks, if these technologies are believed to be relevant, to be useful, if they perceive that they can have control, if they perceive that they have the skills to deal with these technologies. And this is a question that both the organization as a whole and each professional need to answer before taking a decision. Otherwise, these technologies are not creating value, but destroying value. And this is very dangerous for the future of the company. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. I can just address one question to Irma, who can provide an insight on risk management and risk communication.
Yes. So before going to your question, Mark, I will just briefly touch on the question we received before from the audience about the board composition that both Nicola and Rosanna have already addressed. And I would just stress one more point that when we talk about board composition is based on principles, but certainly it is very important because the composition of the board becomes determines the way the decision-making process is put in place. So we know that every company needs to have an appropriate procedure for appointing the board, and I would stress the importance of the word of diversity. So diversity in terms of race, gender, education. So the wider is the composition of the board, and this goes back to the previous question about the need for a variety of people in the board. So the wider the composition, the better is the decision-making process. So I believe the role of the nomination committee, the role of appointing members in the board is very important because it determines the decision-making process. And the wider is the board composition, the better it represents the interests of a variety of stakeholders. So I think the question touched on a very important discussion, even in academic literature, on board composition and its effectiveness for the decision-making process. But going back to your question about a bit about the relationship between risk management and risk communication. So I tried to touch on this a little bit even in my previous talks, because I strongly believe on the importance of risk communication, and it is also a bit of a bias because this is a core area of research for me. We have talked a lot so far about the processes, the procedures. These are very important. So the management of the risks, setting up all the activities in a rigorous, in a sound, in an adequate way. But then it comes to the following part, the following step about communicating the efforts to a variety of stakeholders. And I think sometimes the risk is that we may underestimate this part, but it is the most important and the most effective one. The corporate codes that I already mentioned before, they stress the importance of communicating. So it is not just enough to do the right thing and have a wonderful system in place, wonderful procedures in place, but it is even more important to be able to communicate the effort done to a variety of stakeholders. There are, for some stock exchanges, the listing rules require to disclose information. The codes include the UK code, for example, has a comply or explain approach. So companies need to explain, need to comply, but if not, they can explain the reason why the compliance cannot happen. So the reason of non-compliance. And it's a similar principle that we find across several regulations. And as a researcher, the last point I would like to share on this is what are the benefits of this? So what is the motivation that should lead the companies to invest in communication related to risk? Because risk management is it consumes resources, and communication also requires resources and efforts for every organization. So why it is so important? There is plenty of literature that shows plenty of benefits the companies can experience from an enhanced disclosure, even risk disclosure, even disclosure related to risks. And this happens in different sectors. So this means a better relationship with the stakeholders. Very interesting is the reduction in the cost of capital. So easier access to capital is a higher reputation, so a better way to present yourself to all the internal stakeholders. Why not? Future employees want to work for your organization, but even more important, external stakeholders, providers of capital, who wants and needs to be reassured about the soundness of an organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Irma. We have just 5 minutes before to finish this webinar, and I can ask again, I can address a question to Nicola, if you can just provide an insight on sustainability and risk management. A really very short answer if you can. After that, we are going to close this webinar.
Yes, thanks, Marco. Sustainability, as I mentioned earlier, is becoming increasingly important. And I think it's a topic that cannot be neglected in the near future. So sustainability issues affect organizations in different ways. We need to remember that normally our thoughts are always oriented towards climate change, environmental issues, but there is something more, okay? Because we also refer to social issues, governance issues, so what we used to call with the acronym ESG, okay, environmental, social, and governance risks. So there are more risks that should be taken into account. It's not the case that we always need to avoid such risks. Sometimes we have to manage those risks. And the paradox is that sometimes we need to even increase the exposure to these risks in order to attain the sustainability goals. Okay, so that's the main paradox. And organization, they can use their influence also to contribute to meeting these environmental and social challenges. So they seek to make an impact on sustainable development. So let's think about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, that can be used as an instrument. And of course, you know, seeking to make an impact and managing risk can be considered like two completely different things. But making an impact will most likely in the long run also contribute to mitigating the risks to which the organization is exposed. Okay, so that's, I would say, my opinion, the most important thing. And of course, one of the challenges is to be able to assess the magnitude of many of these risks, because this is something that sometimes it's an ideal complexity, sometimes it's even not possible to assess this magnitude. So that's also something that should be addressed in the future. And I think also the legislation is making an effort towards the direction. So let's think about the new directive that is proposed by the European Union and the effort of the European Union to prepare a unique standard also of reporting, because now there are let's say 5 organizations who are mainly publishing frameworks about sustainability reports, about how to prepare sustainability reports, guidelines, but worldwide there are more than 600 different guidelines and frameworks. So I think this harmonization, standardization is definitely necessary, as well as the use and the preparation of homogeneous indicators that can be used by risk managers. Thanks, Marco.
Thank you very much, Nicola. We are perfectly in time to take all together a coffee. It's coffee time, and it's 11 o'clock more or less. So I'm really grateful to everyone who stayed with us until the end of this webinar. But first of all, I would like to ask to Paola, as now like the owner, as host of this event, if you want to provide the final greetings to our attendees.
Well, I want simply to thank all the speakers for the suggestions they gave us, and all the attendees for having participated to this event, which which we prepared with a very long time and attention. Okay, thank you all. Angelica.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you very much, everybody. I switch in Italy in order to better understand to our attendees. But first, maybe I have to read a last message arrived from Christina, who writes, "Thank you very much and congratulations to all of you for the outstanding webinar. Thanks for the interesting webinar by Thomas." So a lot of different messages to congratulate with our panel are arriving. I remember that Tess Ruivas is waiting for you. You can see the instruction here on your screen. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a nice day. Grazie a tutti, a presto.
Grazie, Angelica.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.